Good morning, friend. Welcome back to Locally Raised. We have a big canning morning ahead of us today. I'm actually working with a 3-canner operation this morning. My mom has a Nesco canner and I have 2 Nesco canners, so I asked to borrow hers so that I'd have more capacity to can some meals in a jar. I really want some meals in a jar on my pantry shelf because I tore through them the last time we made them. I find them so nice for those days where I just run out of time or run out of energy. So we're going to make 3 recipes this morning. We're going to make a roast pork in spicy broth. I've not tried that before and I'm excited to give it a try. We're also going to make a chicken and gravy recipe and beef stroganoff. We've made these 2 together before, so I know my family loves them. We've just run out and we need some more. Let me show you the ingredients I've prepped for this morning. Last night and this morning, I chopped up everything I need because I just enjoy canning so much more when things are prepped ahead of time. So the night before a big canning project, I make up a chop list. I have terrible handwriting, but you can see it there. So I just take inventory of everything that needs to be cut up across all the recipes that I'm using. It's easy to get organized if I've got this and I can chop everything ahead of time, and it helps things flow quickly and smoothly. So we're going to start with that roast pork in spicy broth. This is pork shoulder. It's often referred to as pork butt or Boston butt, pork butt roast. So I'm trying to spread it out so that the chunks are in a single layer. Sprinkling a teaspoon of salt, plus some black pepper. Going to try to distribute that salt a bit. It's going in the oven at 425 for 30 minutes. While the pork roasts, I'm going to start working on the broth for this soup. I'm using 2 quarts of homemade chicken bone broth. Every time that I roast a whole chicken, I use the bones the next day to make broth. And I make 2 rounds of broth with the bones. So the first round is always a little bit richer and the second round is more mild. So the first round I label CB1, chicken broth first round, and that goes into the freezer for soups. And then the second round, CB2, also goes into the freezer, and I use that for things like cooking rice. Just makes the rice a little richer and more flavorful and sneaks in some nutrients when I'm feeding my kids. So this is 2 quarts of the CB1 broth, the good stuff. I'm going to add in some sliced onions, 3 cloves of garlic, minced, some oregano. All of that was from the garden, which is really satisfying. Tablespoon of salt. I'm using Redmond real salt, which I put in everything. At this point, the recipe calls for adding crushed red pepper to the broth. I love a spicy broth. John will love a spicy broth, but there's no way my kids can eat that. So I'm going to skip that step. It's always okay to leave a seasoning out of a canning recipe. That's a safe practice. So John and I will just make our broth spicy when we eat it, and I'll still be able to have stuff that my kids can eat too. I'm also going to add a few slices of ginger. This is not included in the recipe. I won't actually leave the ginger in when I can this. The ginger is just for infusing a little flavor into the broth. That's another thing that's a safe canning practice or a safe tweak to make. Things like bay leaves could be put in when you're making a broth, and then you can take it out before canning. And you haven't added ingredients to the canning list. You've just added or tweaked the flavor a bit. Now that this is simmering, I'm going to turn it down a bit and cover it and let that simmer for 5 minutes. While my pork finishes roasting in the oven and my broth finishes simmering on the stove, I'm going to get these canners prepped so they're ready to go. I washed my jars in the dishwasher last night. I always put them on the night before a canning day so that they're clean and ready to go. Jars don't need to be sterilized anymore. And so I'm going to fill each of these and use the browning function to keep my jars hot so that they're ready for canning. I'll start with just prepping one canner because that's all I need for this first recipe. So I've got 1 quart of hot water going in, 2 quarts, and then I'm going to put 3 jars filled with water in here. Cloves, set to brown and start. This step is just for getting my jars hot so that they're hot when I fill them. You don't have to do this step in your canner. If you have another tried and true method that you like to use for getting your jars hot, that's fine as well. I just peeked in on the meat. Oh, it looks so good. I haven't canned pork before, so I'm excited to see what this flavor is like. That smells so good. I'm really eager to see what pressure canned pork tastes like and what the texture is like. I'm going to fish those ginger bits out of this broth so I can fill my jars. All right, trading sides so I can load up my jars. I just stopped the browning function. My jars are nice and hot, ready to be filled. Just going to dump out the water. And my jars are ready for filling. This is 3 pounds of pork, and each jar is supposed to get 1 pound. So I'm just going to see if I can eyeball this. I'm using my 4 jars canning lids here. I switched to them a couple months ago and I've been really happy with them. They're shaped differently than other lids I've used. They curve down over a little bit and I think that helps them seal more consistently. Just adding bands here, tightening to fingertip tight. You can see my canner is prepped with 2 quarts of water and the canning rack inside. So I'm ready to start processing these. The first thing I'm going to do is check that pressure gauge and make sure that it's set to exhaust. You can see the arrow here is pointing to exhaust. My pressure limiting valve is black. If you're canning at 1,000 feet above sea level or higher, you should be using the green valve. And I'm going to set to high, add 90 minutes on the timer, and start. Now I'm waiting for that to start its 10-minute countdown before I set the gauge to airtight. The canner just beeped, so it started its 10-minute countdown. The glare is kind of bad, but maybe you can see the E9 on there. So when that reaches E0, I will rotate the pressure valve, and then it will start the canning process. The canner just beeped and displayed 90 minutes, so I'm going to set this to airtight. Now that the pork is already canning, it's time to move on to the chicken and gravy. So I just heated these jars in the canner using the browning function. One of you gave me the tip of starting off with a bit of broth in the bottom of the jar. It makes debubbling easier, so I was excited to give that a try. All right, this is a raw pack meal, so it should come together pretty quickly. I should mention, by the way, that all of today's meals come from the all-new Ball Book of Canning and Preserving. I was really excited about this book because it had this page with meal in a jar recipes, which we hadn't seen in previous Ball Books. So I'll give you a close-up look at these recipes. I have written in the margins here the amounts that it takes to fill 1 jar. 1 quart jar, that is. So all the recipes list the amount for 2 quart jars. It's because that's the smallest amount that you can safely pressure can at a time. But when I'm making a raw pack recipe, I fill things 1 jar at a time. So for me, writing that in the margins makes it really easy to make any number of jars that I want without making mistakes. I'm actually going to start out with my seasonings so that those get right into the broth and get incorporated. So each jar gets 1 teaspoon of salt, and a ½ teaspoon of black pepper. I just can't bring myself to measure pepper. I'd rather crack it right in. I imagine this is pepper light. I'm probably not getting a ½ teaspoon in there, but I'm okay with that. We can always crack pepper over our meal when we eat it. And sometimes my kids are fussy about pepper. Now it calls for a teaspoon of poultry seasoning. I don't keep poultry seasoning on hand, so I'm just going to use thyme instead. This thyme is from the garden. I'm going to measure out a generous teaspoon and then crush it because it's not quite broken down as much as I'd like. Of course, I've made a mess. That's all right. The last time I made this, I used thyme and sage as a substitute for poultry. One of you mentioned that sage is supposed to be very bitter after it's been canned. I appreciate when you guys tell me these things because I have been canning for some time, but there's still lots to learn. I hadn't noticed it being especially bitter, but there was a really small amount in here. Anyhow, I've decided, I looked it up, that's absolutely right. So I'm going to skip the sage this time and maybe we'll appreciate this flavor even more. Next is 2 tablespoons of dry white wine. This is optional, but I think it sounds like a really good option. I liked it last time we did it. I always like the way wine adds a little more depth of flavor to a broth. Okay, now I'm going to do the whole ingredients. These are potatoes from our garden. I definitely want to grow more potatoes next year. I had no idea how quickly, now that my kids are getting a little bigger, they're actually like mouths to feed. They used to be so tiny, they ate basically nothing. And I'm realizing now how quickly my family can work through some potatoes. So next year I think I'll aim to grow more. I might try to grow twice as many potatoes next year. All right, we've got a ½ cup of onions. And of course I could use my funnel here. I just don't feel like it right now. Sometimes things go faster when I ditch the gear. Then a ½ cup celery. This is the only veggie in this dish that I didn't grow. I'm trying to decide if I want to try growing celery next year. I've never grown it before. If you've grown celery, let me know if you think it's worth the effort. Garden space is limited, so I'm always asking myself, is this the thing that's worth giving up space for? And I know I'm using my hands a lot here, but they are clean. I just can't seem to cook or can without doing some stuff by hand. You might be able to hear my canner kind of hissing away now. Last, we've got the chicken going in. This chicken I measured ahead of time. Well, I weighed it out and it's 4 pounds. So I know each jar should get 1 pound. I'm actually wondering if I'm going to be able to fit that much in. I think when I debubble this, I'll settle down a bit. I remember having trouble fitting all this in the last time I did this. All right, let's go get some broth in these. I love seeing all these layers before the broth goes in. I've got my broth already boiling here. This is some of that chicken broth I made. This is a CB2, so that's from the second round of using bones. For a recipe like this where the broth isn't featured like it is in a soup, the broth just kind of helps make a gravy and cook the ingredients, I'm okay with using the less flavorful broth. So that means that I was able to do all of this canning with the chicken broth from one chicken. That one chicken made those 2 quarts of the first round and 2 quarts of the second round. I really like that I could stretch our food like that. These jars were packed so full that I had to use my headspace tool just to move things around and allow the broth to settle into the jar. This recipe, again, like the pork recipe, called for an inch of headspace. I'm giving a generous inch. It might be more like an inch and a quarter. That's 4 more jars ready to go into the canner. I really am looking forward to eating these, and it's just good to know that I put this together in half an hour, not including chop time, but that's half an hour for 4 meals. I love that. That pork is really noisy. It's producing a lot of steam. Into the second canner, I'm going to put these. Close and swivel, and then it's high. "90 minutes and start." I'm just starting to heat some beef broth so that we can move on to our final recipe. Moving on to the last recipe, the beef stroganoff. I've got a bit of beef broth in the bottom of my jars, and they're ready to fill. I'm going to start again with the seasonings. I like getting that into the broth so it's just easily incorporated into everything. So I'll start with a teaspoon of salt. My kids refer to this dish as mud meat. I think it's because it's meat in brown gravy. I know that's not an appealing name, but they like it. So I don't care what they call it. I'm happy. All right, pepper. Just realized I left my Worcestershire sauce in the fridge. 2 tablespoons Worcestershire. I just heard a canner beep. I think I need to go switch another valve to airtight. Never mind, I forgot that was the 10-minute countdown. Next time it beeps, I'll switch over. Got that thyme from the garden again. I think I won't crush it this time. It made such a mess. I'm sure the canning process will bring out its flavor. And a teaspoon of dried parsley. That's the one thing I didn't dry from the garden this year. Maybe next year I'll dry some parsley from the garden. Garlic cloves. This is 3 cloves. I've already sliced them, so I'm just going to try to divide them evenly. I have got to plant my garlic. I actually put it on my calendar for tomorrow because I keep forgetting to do it. Here in Zone 6B, it's getting late to get garlic in the ground. I should have done it by now. Garlic is one of the things I was most satisfied with harvesting this year, so I definitely want a good garlic harvest next year. I've got to make that happen. All right, moving on to the solid foods. Putting a 1/2 cup onion in each jar. As I sliced up these onions this morning, I realized I'm coming close to the end of what I grew. So I knew I wasn't growing a year's supply of onions, but I think next year I could probably plant twice as much and see myself through a little more of the year. I'm happy to scale up with things like potatoes and onions that don't take effort to preserve. It's things like cucumbers and tomatoes and peppers that I don't want to scale up right now. Next is a 1/2 cup mushrooms. I'm using mushrooms from Costco. They sell a gourmet dried mushroom mix, which oddly enough I bought as an impulse buy. I don't know why, it seemed really exciting to me at the time and I had no clue how I'd use it. It's really convenient to have dried mushrooms on hand, so I can just hydrate them whenever I need some. Next is tomato paste. This is from the garden too. Last time I made this, I used tomato paste that my mom had canned because I've never made my own before. So this is my first time. I love it. Unfortunately, at this point, my camera was not on when I added the tomato paste and the beef chuck roast. So I added 2 tablespoons tomato paste and 1 pound of chuck roast cubed to each jar. Now I'm just filling jars with beef broth, again to a generous 1 inch of headspace, maybe more like 1 1/4. Now you know the drill. The rims were wiped down and lids went on, and then bands were tightened to fingertip tight. I was just about to put my beef stroganoff in the 3rd canner. You can hear the other 2 are going, but I encountered a problem I've never had before. I've been using these for a couple years now, and this has never happened to me. The canner won't open. I had it set to the browning function to heat up and heat the jars before I used them, and when I came over to try to open it, it just cannot rotate. So I looked it up online, and it looks like I probably need to let this cool off. Maybe it's got some sort of tight seal for some reason or other. So I've unplugged it, and I'm just going to let it cool for a bit, and hopefully that solves the problem and I can continue with my project. Okay, we're back in business. John helped me out and the problem is solved. So I'll show you what we did just in case this ever happens to anyone else. I had the pressure limiting valve set too far over in the exhaust area. So it should have been about here, but it kind of slid over, and I think that held some of the pressure in, and then the pressure and the heat was too great to be able to open it. So we had to wear an oven mitt because a lot of steam came out at this point, but we held it to this point, let all the pressure out, unplugged it so that it cooled off, and then after a few minutes of cooling off, we were able to rotate it and open it. So let's get those final meals into the canner. So to high, 90 minutes and start. Now we've got 3 canners working at the same time. So that's 3 canners, 3 recipes, 10 meals that are now on the make. In case you're curious about the time investment and the amount of mess created, I'm always curious about what a project costs in terms of time and energy. I'll give you a look at the kitchen. Here's the state of affairs. A few dirty dishes. Of course, I did my chopping yesterday, so that helped eliminate some mess. I've got a bit of mess over here and over here. I've been working on this for about 2 hours now, but I've also been filming, and everything takes me longer while filming. I'm sure someday I'll get faster at it. I would say that if I weren't filming, this probably would have taken me a little over an hour, maybe an hour and 15 minutes. And of course, I had things chopped and prepped. That was actually the most time consuming, especially cutting up the meat. I think I spent about 2 hours in the chopping prep. So I would say all 10 of these meals took me a little bit over 3 hours. I'm happy with that. I'm mostly happy that I got to do this in the morning while I have energy. And now in the evening, I can afford to be a little bit tired, and I can just put one of these on the stove to heat up, and we'll have a good dinner. I gave the canners several hours to cool because I got wrapped up doing other things, so I took out all the meals at the same time. This first batch is the pork and spicy broth. Here's the chicken and gravy. And then finally the beef stroganoff. I'm happy to say that I checked on them after several hours of cooling and they all sealed. The next night we opened up a jar of the pork and spicy broth for dinner. I wanted to try making this like an Asian style noodle soup, so I stretched the broth a bit. It was pretty rich, so I was able to add a half quart of water to create more broth. And then to that broth I added a handful of rice noodles. All that takes is 3 minutes boiling in the broth for the rice noodles to be cooked. So this soup came together in 10 minutes. And it turned out to be delicious. I was really pleasantly surprised by how much my kids enjoyed it. I know I talk a lot about what they like and don't like, but they're picky eaters, and so it's always a gamble giving them something new. They really liked these long noodles and that good rich broth, and just that little bit of meat was the right amount for us. Back when my husband John and I were dating, we were fortunate to be able to travel around Asia a little bit together because I was teaching at a school in China. And so this meal kind of took me right back to that time, and I just was really happy with it. We will be making this one again. Thanks for joining me for a morning of canning. Let me know if you give any of these recipes a try. I look forward to sharing more with you next week.